climate action, working in Europe, in the Americas, in Asia, and in China, where, as we know, there is a lot of work to be done to build on the incredible work that's already been done over the last 20 years of action on green economy and green finance. Today, we have an event, a webinar on the topic of transition finance, driving capital towards neutrality by 2060. President Xi Jinping has made the announcement that China will achieve carbon neutrality by 2060 and in fact achieve peak emissions before 2030. We not only believe that China will absolutely meet those targets, we actually believe they will get there before that, but of course that's the discussion today. In doing that, we need to acknowledge a couple of things. We have huge challenges. The reason why China has made these commitments and the reason why 110 countries around the world have made net zero by 2050 commitments. Japan and Korea came in just after China, for example, is a recognition by the countries of the world, the signatories to the Paris Climate Change Agreement, that we are not doing as well as we should have on meeting our climate targets, and we need to step up action. The Biden administration in the US has indicated it will now join China and the other countries of the world by announcing ambitious targets for 2050. We have now consensus about what the shape of the future will look like around the world. It will be green and clean. It will be low carbon and climate resilient. What we're now on is a race to address the speed of the transition. To achieve our targets, we have a lot of work to do, and we have a lot of capital to deploy. This revolution in the world's economy, in the Chinese economy, will take about $90 trillion US of investment between now and 2050. This is a huge amount of capital, gigantic pipeline that's required, as well as a huge amount of projects to be developed. We need to be understanding it's not just building solar and wind energy. It's also about how we convert our cement industries, our steel industries. We need steel. We just need it to be zero carbon, not high carbon. We need aviation. We need to ensure low carbon aviation, not high carbon, and shipping, and oil and gas for that matter, with existing facilities need to see an improvement of emissions profile. There's a lot to be done. There's a lot of investment opportunity in all of this. That's what we're going to explore today. It is clear from the announcement of our leaders, the laudable, the positive, the productive announcements of the past year, made as part of a dramatic change of thinking in this time of a pandemic, of COVID. It is clear that there is a commitment now to change, to build back better as we recover from this pandemic, which, by the way, is a climate incident when we look at it. It's rooted in pathogens jumping between species as a result of degraded biodiversity in parts of the world. This is not unique, by the way. We've had other things that could have got away, MERS, SARS. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been saying for 30 years, we are likely to see pandemic after pandemic as a result of climate change changing our environmental conditions for action. So we shouldn't be surprised. The climate scientists were certainly not surprised. Change will not be linear. It'll be jagged. As we come out of every crisis, because there will be more, the build back better mantra will become the norm. And of course, that's what we're going to do now. So this idea of transition finance is going to be explored a little bit by Michelle Horsfield, who's the Climate Transitions Manager at the Climate Bonds Initiative. She's going to do a short presentation. I do want to just draw attention to our esteemed, our speakers, our friends who've joined us today. We have first, instead of Liao Wan, we have Lu Wenqin, who's a director of Green Finance Department of CECEP, who's stepping in because Liao Wan had to be called away to an urgent government meeting at short notice. However, I'm going to say we're very lucky to have Mr. Lu with us because he's the genius, he's the brains behind the work on green taxonomy and green definition in China. We also have our fantastic colleague, Lu Zhengwei, who's the chief economist of the China Industrial Bank. If you don't know about the China Industrial Bank, you need to know this has been the bank that has been the leader on green finance for many years in China. It first created a sustainable finance department. It's been a pioneer in green bond issuance and many other measures. So we're very lucky to have Mr. Lu with us today. We have Tanguy Claquin, who is at Credit Agricole Corporate and Investment Bank, who is, what can I say, probably the world's leading green bond banker. He has been a colleague of mine at the EU Technical Expert Group on Sustainable Finance, crafting taxonomy in Europe. He's been an architect of the European Union Green Bond Standard and many other measures, but above all, he is an extraordinarily successful green bond banker. We're lucky to have him today. And then finally, at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, Stefan Shin. Stefan, you may not have heard of Stefan. He is the architect between the extraordinary commitment by the AIIB to climate bonds, to climate lending, the partnership they've done with Amundi to create a climate investment framework, and many other measures. The AIIB is really pushing the envelope and focusing on how it can drive transitions in markets as well as transitions in infrastructure. So, as you can see, I'm very excited by my panel. This is a very exciting group. To kick us off, I'd like to get Michelle to do a short presentation of thinking we've had so far on transitions. Please, Michelle.
Thank you, Sean. I will just talk actually, instead of present. I've got some things I want to share, really based around the paper we published in September. We are all aware that meeting climate goals requires moving whole economies. The green bond market to date, dominated by renewable energy, buildings, transport and water infrastructure, has seen that there are some key sectors that need to decarbonise and are not yet active at scale. We laid out a framework for wide participation to hit those global-wide, economy-wide climate goals in our white paper in September. It's a list, of a procurement list that sets criteria for transition activities. We also want to expand our standard and certification scheme and our databases to provide tools that investors and borrowers need. We want to support policymakers and regulators with our advisory services and taxonomy development expertise. Ultimately, we want to increase understanding of transition across the finance space, and this webinar is part of that. I look forward to hearing you all speak later on. I want to lay out a little of our white paper. I will give some examples and then talk about some of the principles that we need to avoid greenwashing. So our paper was essentially a proposal to the market on what a credible transition in the real world is about. My background is in heavy industry, and I know that this is not easy by any stretch of the imagination, but it's necessary. Our paper provides a framework for all the different types and dimensions of transition. We set out some principles and also a proposal for how a transition label might be used. It has three key features. These are the features that we think credible transition needs. Firstly, it must be ambitious. The underlying goal is rapid decarbonisation to align the global economy with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So we define a green transition. Secondly, it's got to be inclusive. It's got space for the traditionally green as well as the brown actors. And by that, I mean the green aspects like perhaps solar power, the renewables, the space that we have traditionally been in, but it has got to be incorporating those other heavy, high carbon emitters as well. Thirdly, and this is of interest, I'm sure, from the finance perspective, it's got to be flexible. So our proposals are broad enough to encompass both tied and general purpose finance. This is not just about bonds. So our paper gave some a structure classifying economic activities into one of 5 categories. There are some that are near zero already, like wind energy. There are some that are on a pathway to zero activity. For example, a shipping fleet operator. They currently operate on a fossil fuel-based fuel, but they could be based on something else. Thirdly, the no pathway. And these are things where, like long-haul passenger aviation, where we don't yet have a viable substitute. The 4th category, those interim activities that we need for the time being, but we hope won't be needed after 2050. And 5th, the stranded activities. So for example, electricity generation from solid fossil fuels. There are, of course, also enabling technologies that will come as part of the transition, like hydrogen, for example. I give 3 examples next. First one is cement production. We feel this is an example that fits in the pathway to zero. And transition here means decarbonising the activity as fast as possible. Decarbonising measures initially could be to change the energy source, maximise energy efficiency. And over time, the activity would shift so that the entity becomes a low carbon cement producer. Second example, an interim category. Let's say operating a gas network. Transition here means phasing out the activity in line with their future sunset date, and in the meantime, decarbonising them as fast as possible. Initially, it could be about stopping fugitive emissions. The activity then could move to becoming a low carbon hydrogen distribution network. The third example is stranded activities. Say, for example, operating a coal-fired power station. Transition for this category means phasing out activities with immediate effect, and at the same time taking measures that can deliver the substantial emissions reductions in those activities so that we don't result with a lock-in. Over time, we would look to shift that from being a producer of power from coal to being a low carbon power producer. I want to talk a little bit now about the principles. So this is the aspects that will help us to avoid the accusations of greenwashing. And by extension, of course, associated financing of that transition will also be credible. So the first one is that it needs to be in line with the 1.5 degree trajectory. So this is about having plans in place that will meet that Paris goal. Secondly, it should be driven by science and scientists so that it's consistent for all. It needs to be harmonized across countries, but needs to also have some local flexibilities. It is tricky to navigate at present. The third principle, it's a technical one, that we need to count our own actions. And we're also suggesting not to count Scope 3 downstream emissions because they're out with our control. The fourth principle, that it should be based on technology, not at the moment about economics, because we've seen with renewables that those can change rapidly. And the fifth one is critical. This is not just about promises and pledges. It needs to be a demonstration, not just a plan for a plan. So our contribution, we will be expanding the climate bond standard and certification scheme. We will be undertaking market tracking of transition bonds and other transition-related finance, and our advisory services to governments. We want to see financial instruments played out across this spectrum. For those low carbon activities, the decarbonisation measures, it might be a use of proceeds bonds or an asset-backed security. But for these low carbon entities, it could be financed by sustainability linked loans, a general purpose bond. There are lots of options. I want to close with a quote from a lady who I hugely admire, who essentially navigated the Paris Agreement. Her name is Christiana Figueres. And she describes that this decade is a moment of choice unlike any we have ever faced. And we need stubborn optimism to change the reality we have into the reality we want. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michelle. As the scene set up, wonderful. I now want to ask my good friend, Mr. Lu Wenqin from the CECEP. What you need to know about his work is that he and his team have been responsible for the drafting of China's green industry guidelines and green bond catalogues, or green projects catalogues. And he's now also helping develop the new climate finance and investment regime for the Ministry of Ecology and Environment. He's working across a range of areas. Wenqin, can I ask you about something close to my heart, opportunities? What do you see as the big opportunities in China around transition finance, and also the hurdles while you're at it? We need to look at both sides of the coin. Over to you.
非常感谢肖恩的邀请，我们也很荣幸能有机会在这个地方对我们所做的一些工作做一些介绍。关于转型金融，我们想就是说，刚才肖恩也谈到了我们在整个中国绿色金融标准方面做的一些工作，但是呢，是具体到中国这个层面呢，我们觉得就是说，现在转型金融提出来这个课题是非常好的一个想法。为什么呢？我们中国这个就是说，在现在国民经济的产业这个发展阶段呢，我们的这个制造业的比例是非常高的，然后我们能源转型也面对非常大的一个压力。那么在制造业这个行业中呢，实际上我们可以看到，从数据的分析可以看到，就是说大量的排放，除能源之外，最重要的一个排放源就是在这个制造业这个行业产生的，比如说我们的钢铁行业、我们的建材行业，还有我们的化工这样一些行业。但是这些行业呢，就是说我们可以看到，可以说它既是一个减排空间非常广阔的一个领域，对我们的2摄氏度的目标、1.5摄氏度的目标非常有贡献大的一个领域。另一方面呢，它就说也是我们前面就说是，既然是它贡献大，这是一个问题的两个方面，它的排放量的非常大，它从另一方面来看的话，它的这个减排的潜力也就非常大了，这是我们应该去十分关注的一个领域啊，我们应该把它提到一个更重要的一个位置上啊，去解决这样的问题，去解决一个我们这个制造业、我们重工业行业的这样一个，也就是现在我们大家通常说到的我们棕色领域的一个转型的问题啊，这将对这个我们国家的这个减排、中国的减排呢，造成一个非常大的一个贡献。这是我们觉得这是一个非常广阔的一个，可以叫做机遇吧，也是金融系统的一个机遇。既然我们有一个很大的减排空间的一个行动领域呢，我们不应该放弃它。那么从另一方面，我想谈谈这个转型就是说转型领域的一个挑战。 那么我们大家都知道，就是在转型领域呢，基本上就说在国内来看的话，这样的领域普遍面临一个产能过剩的问题，也是我们产能需要调整的问题。我们看到我们相关的政策呀，都有一个两高一剩的这样一个产业调整，这样相关的一些政策。那么对于这样的一些行业呢，在金融介入的时候，其实也面临一个非常严峻的挑战，就是我们一方面是要促成这个行业的优化升级，我们的减排，我们的一个技术升级迭代更新啊，一个低碳化的发展。另一方面呢，也面临一个行业的整体的就是落后产能的淘汰的问题。那么我们金融机构或者我们叫资本市场去介入这个领域的时候，我们实际上对这个领域的一个发展趋势，我们一个项目的一个水平，就是说我们项目的一个风险呢的把控，需要一个更高的一个能力，这对金融机构也是一个挑战啊。我们觉得就是说，我们就说金融系统介入我们这个中色领域的时候呢，可能需要在能力上，我们在标准上，我们在各个方面的一个治理上、信息透明度上，我们都需要做更多的工作啊。我大致先谈这么一些观点啊，谢谢。
If you were to pick a few sectors you thought were most urgent or where the biggest opportunities were, what would they be? Energy, transport, steel? Give us a sense of the investor opportunities.
现在在国内钢铁行业呢，可以说从碳排放量这个数据分析来看，它可能是一个第二大的行业。我们第一大行业可能是我们的电力行业。那么，但是呢，在国内钢铁行业呢，相对的来讲，它的这个产能已经到了一个收缩的阶段。那么在其他领域呢，我们建材领域可能也面临同样的一些情况。除此之外呢，我想在其他的领域，就说是不但是有一个就说是空间，也可能有更多的机会。我想这个中国的现在我们大家也提到，就是说是一些产业，我最近也了解到，我们一些地方呢，我们一些钢铁企业呢，我们都开始做这个碳达峰、碳中和这样的一些课题的这样研究，就具体想探索，就说是想明确我们钢铁具体怎么转型。我们以前钢铁行业呢，可能将重点放在这个污染治理这样一个环节上，现在呢，可能要把这样的一个问题要放在一块考虑，我们能不能直接通过一些技术的升级手段，我们在治理污染的同时，我们也达到一个那个低碳零碳转型的这样目标。比如说我们的氢能炼钢，现在我们大家都提到了这样的一些设想。那么这个行业的技术发展呢，到底是一个什么趋势呢？我想最近都是一个重点，这行业非常大的一个重点。我想呢，除了钢铁行业之外，其他行业包括我们的水泥行业，可能都存在这样的问题。我想这都会有很多的一些机会存在啊，谢谢。
The iron and steel industry has already seen some fantastic announcements. Baowu Steel has announced a drive towards low carbon steel. So we hope to see a lot happening. Of course, China on cement is so important because more cement has been poured in China in the last few years than the rest of the world combined. Some of the statistics around cement are extraordinary. So there are opportunities there. Lu Sengwei, you're looking at this from the point of view of one of China's largest banks, and of course the bank that's been at a leader of green finance. Can you tell us what your thoughts are on opportunities and hurdles, but also about the implications of President Xi Jinping's commitments on industry in China? You're on mute, I'm afraid.
首先这个感谢这个思远先生，然后刚才这个 Michelle 的分享呢也非常棒，然后我听了之后呢也都特别受鼓舞，也非常受启发。对于机遇呢，我想说， 碳达峰、碳中和，其实是一场经济社会全局的深刻变革。当然，这句话其实这个习近平总书记呢也讲过。而我们目前的经济其实是建立在上一轮化石能源为基础的工业革命基础之上的，所以几乎所有的经济活动都或多或少的都有这个温室气体的排放问题，所以存在着大量的高碳排的大量的这个行业需要被改造。但是呢，我们从目前来看，这个我们就说中国吧，截止到去年末，我们的绿色信贷是12万亿，这已经在全球已经是很大的了。绿色债券是8000亿，当然都是人民币啊，这放在全球其实也是排名前列的这个规模。但是我不知道大家有没有注意过，中国的商业银行的总资产的规模是多少？总资产的规模其实代表了各种融资，是吧？它的规模。这种融资规模是多少呢？320万亿。而我们去年绿色的贷款债券加起来不到13万亿，如果我们再加上股票，可能也大数也就是13万亿左右。所以对于这样一个320万亿的规模来说，其实是非常非常微不足道的。所以我们显然也不能单靠过去的贴标的绿色融资来承载一场全局性的经济转型。在这个转型的过程当中，随着一些技术的变化，有一些排碳的项目会退出历史舞台，但是仍然会有一些排碳的项目在2050年和2060年之后仍然没有替代品，而继续为社会所需要。所以呢，我想无论是逐步退出的还是仍将存在的，都需要大量的低碳改造。所以我觉得 Michelle 刚才提的转型的这个概念非常的重要，而且非常的这个迫切。同时呢，从我们 CBI 的这个提的转型的这个概念来说，它与传统的绿债有着明显的不同。比如传统的绿债呢是对应着具体的项目的，但是转型这种融资呢是可以对应实体的，就是一个主体的，而且它不仅仅指债，它可以包含各种融资。所以呢，绿债的好处，它是确保这个资金投向了绿色的领域，但是却没有锁定整个企业的路径，因此也可能存在一个主体我同时上绿色的项目和非绿色的项目的问题，从而它对整个经济的净效果没有办法进行评估。但是呢，转型融资它是对实体的，只要实体是面向碳中和的这个目标有一个清晰的规划的，那么它对巴黎协定对于整个经济的净效果反倒可以比绿债更可预期。所以我想我讲的这2点其实是它非常重要的机遇。就是第一个呢，传统的绿色标签的太小，所以的确需要大量的转型融资才能支撑整个社会的向低碳的迈进。第二个呢，它使得这个绿色融资的主体啊，他们在降碳的，就是在碳中和的这个路上变得更可预期。但是我们也承认啊，它的确有还有很多的障碍，需要 Michelle 在后面帮助我们大家来解决。比如说，第一个障碍就是如何在转型与洗绿的嫌疑之间进行有效的区分。虽然 Michelle 刚才讲到了，我也在这次会议之前仔细的阅读了这个咱们即将这个发布的这个白皮书。那因为如果这个区分不清楚的话，就没有办法，这个主体啊就没有办法避免它的生命风险，同时我们也没有办法避免有些主体的它的套利，同时呢，市场和政策层面的评估也会存在困惑。那我们也看到咱们 CBI 的这个白皮书讲了几个原则，比如说讲到了是否存在这个有替代技术选择的问题，那就是如果有替代技术选择，你应该选择这个排碳更低的技术，包括甚至有必要设定阈值。第二个呢，也讲到了企业的战略规划是否与巴黎协定相衔接的问题，这个呢，我觉得看起来都有很好的区分的能力。但是我举一个例子，大家立刻就会有点糊涂了。比如说，提高燃煤电厂的效率，我们可能不能算转型融资，但是呢，煤气层的运输、天然气的发电却都算转型金融。而事实上，发电有更好的方式啊，是吧？ 比如说我们有光伏，我们有风能啊，我们还可以有水电，是吧？所以呢，为什么这个同样是化石能源的天然气的发电就可以算呢？虽然我知道它比这个煤炭的发电排碳可能至少要低1半，对吧？好，这是我想说的它的第一个障碍，就是怎么区分转型和洗绿之间的这个概念的问题。第二个问题呢，就是如何将单个企业的低碳转型与整个经济的低碳转型，特别是有明确时间点的转型达标的那个有效的衔接起来。比如说，我们从技术上看了，说，哎，这个行业的这个企业，它采用现在的这个技术，它虽然排碳，但是比过去低了，它仍然可以算作转型融资。但是当你把所有这样的行业都加起来之后，你是不是能保证对一个国家来说，它一定能够在2050年或者2060年就实现中和了呢？这恐怕是有难度的，是吧？单纯的看一个行业里面这个现在采用的这个技术，可能我们认为它是可以使用转型标签的。但是当你面对着加总的问题的时候，国家却是不一定能够在那个特定的时点达到它中和的目标的。所以这是第二个我觉得很难解决的问题。当然第三个呢，这个就相对于前2个的问题小一点，但依然是一个障碍哈，就是我们很多的转型融资这样子的企业，这样子的项目，它的固定资产投资的规模都很大，具有比较长时间的锁定效应，特别是对于技术仍然在快速变化的行业来说，那这个就尤其难以抉择。比如说，如果我现在不选择新的技术，它仍然是高排碳的，我选择了可能这个技术呢，比如在5年8年之内，它会有新一代的替代技术又出来，还不等我这个投资收回来，可能新的替代技术就基本成熟了。那在这种情况下，我们怎么样来处理这个问题？好，我先说这一些啊，谢谢。
There are many challenges, you're right, and thank you for those comments about the example of coal and gas. I think the real challenge here is what is the requisite ambition in a different sector. One of the things we've looked at is along the lines of what you said of our international work has been what does trajectory of change need to be to meet our commitments? And often it will be, well, more ambitious than we think because of the nature of the targets we have. In Europe, we're certainly wrestling at that question at the moment. Coal and gas in the energy sector, as you say, things we need to understand fully what's got to happen. In the gas sector in Europe, we're acutely aware at the moment that the emissions profile of gas, once you count fugitive emissions, is much higher than we thought in the past. And so its role as a bridging technology is now under investigation. It's not so sure that it really is the bridge that we thought it was. It's looking like it might be necessary for us to meet our targets, to look for ways to leapfrog to green energy and clean energy without using gas. And I think steel is a good example where it's clear that we need to bring the price of green hydrogen generated by renewable energy, down quickly so that we can switch to that rather than have to use gas, go from coke and coal to gas in between if we meet our targets. If we have a shallow transition and we go to gas and then later to green hydrogen, it doesn't look like we can meet these critically important targets that we've set ourselves. This discussion, this examination is the important task for this year. I mean, of course, this is what Lu Wenqing is working on in his work at CECEP. But before I go back to Lu Wenqing about this, I just want to say that it's fantastic, your commitment to this question and examining it. We at Climate Bonds are very committed to working with Chinese organizations, institutions, and banks in supporting this transition to understand what we have to do, but so is Credit Agricole, CIB. So I want to use this as a segue to welcome Tongi to the panel, who has been a leader in mobilizing international capital for the Chinese green finance market. And we've seen in the last year as the Chinese economy has grown faster, well, quickly, while other economies are still caught in the brutal impact of the pandemic, an inflow of funds into China from Europe and other countries, much of it looking for green. In this transitions agenda, Tongi, where do you see the opportunities coming up? What's your reading of the landscape at the moment? Over to you.
Thank you, Sean. Can you hear me well?
Perfect.
Good. So good morning from Paris here, where the spring is coming now, a bit earlier every year. So yesterday was almost a summer day in Paris, and I think it's also the same in Asia from my friends there. So in fact, climate change is something that we try to see earlier and earlier in the year. So in fact, how do I see the landscape? I will come to this point, Sean, very clearly. I want to comment on some of the remarks that were made before by our esteemed colleague from China. Clearly, what for me it underlines is that the most important difficulty that we have right now in this market, in order to avoid greenwashing and in order to channel more investment into a green project, is science, actually. I mean, this is what we need more, because if you think about the example of coal to gas, which is a very valid one, and I think Crédit Agricole has been supporting the idea that in selected area in given country, and that's very true in China, we need to have more gas with an energy efficient, with avoidance of leakages and so on. But if we are able to do that, and if we are able to avoid any fugitive emission, in fact, gas is better than coal. But in order to demonstrate that, to convince investors, to convince market observers, to convince the policymaker, we need to have the science behind us. And it's not so much the science that we used to know well, which is the science of climate change, but it's really the science of the energy system. Can you guarantee somehow that if you put this gas-fired plant at this place, it will displace some coal production elsewhere? And this is a question that is not always easy to solve. And that's the example for coal to gas, but we have many other examples where you were looking at the technology. There is a potential demonstration that this technology has a strong climate impact, but some other people would have a different view on exactly the same, because they would have the calculation that is not on the same parameter, not on the same scope. And in fact, many players in this market are not experts in those topics, and they can rapidly go in one direction and the others, and actually in good faith made choices that sometimes are not well informed from a scientific background, first thing. And second thing, the science itself of this question of carbon reporting is still in its infancy, to be frank. And Sean, you would, I think, agree with that. I mean, in the last 10 years, we have seen a lot of progress driven by the green bond market and by the sustainable finance in general. That is one of the big outcomes of this market. I mean, the attention that has been given to calculation in carbon, but we are still lacking, I would say, a real accounting system that is well recognized everywhere, that is really solid from a scientific standpoint, to tell this given investment or this given asset as this given carbon footprint. And I recognize, I mean, it's nobody's fault. I mean, it's just that we don't have right now the full scientific element. So that's one important element, I think. And I think for this reason, I mean, we will probably see the definition of what is green evolve somehow, or being localized initially. So we will have a taxonomy in Europe. We already have an embryo taxonomy on which, Sean, you've worked a lot, and I have tried to contribute to, and so it's going to move forward. We will probably have, at some point, with the same level of detail, something in China. I hope so. I know the Chinese people, they want to have it, and so I think we will have it. We will have it in the US, but initially, because of the political and because of the industrial reality of those countries, this will not be the same. I hope it will converge very fast. I think this is the most important element probably for the market going forward, is to make sure that the definition of those taxonomies that will exist in various countries will converge rapidly, because the science is the same everywhere, because the planet is the same everywhere. And so we should have a convergence in this taxonomy. Luckily, because in Europe we have started to do something very detailed, I think it will serve as a reference for other areas, not to copy, but just to go to the same level of detail so that we have really a common definition on which we can work and on which we can further develop this market. I want to praise the work that is done by the CBI on that front. Clearly, really an unparalleled commitment to the European taxonomy, despite the fact that you're not the European as an organization. I know that you're doing exactly the same in other jurisdictions, and I think clearly the CBI is playing a role in trying to align, to make sure that the various policymakers in various countries are aligning those taxonomies. This is a key element, and I'm really very happy to say that you're playing a unique role in this market, and thank you for that. What I want to underline too is a recent survey that was done by the European Investment Bank, but it could have been done by anybody else, asking people everywhere in the world what they are ready to give up in order to manage climate change mitigation. Are they ready to give up eating a bit of meat or eating or flying or streaming or whatever? And what is very striking is that the outcome of this survey is the same in China, in Europe, in every European country, and in the US, meaning that citizens of the world, at the end of the day, when we're talking about their individual choices, they are the same. So we have the same science, the same planet, the same gut feeling about what needs to be done. In fact, this is not the same economy, it's not the same history in all countries. So for this reason, it will take time to converge, but I think this will come. So that's a very high level analysis maybe, but I just wanted to underline those points. Now, very clearly in China right now, we have the chance of having issuers which are ready to innovate and which are ready to test ideas and to test new structure. We have done transition bond in China. I know we have a debate about that, Sean, but I think it is necessary to test those ideas. It is necessary to see what can be a good transition bond in China, and we will keep on working at Frederico with every issuer that wants to test those ideas. We've done a blue bond in China too. We've done some of the first green covered bond in China too. So clearly, we have the chance in China to have this strong dynamic at the issuer level, and we have around the table a very high-profile representative of this industry in China, which is trying to develop the financial tools that we need. I mean, for me, as soon as you have transparency and as soon as you have accountability, there is no greenwashing. If you tell what you do and you do what you tell, fair, fine enough. People are big enough to understand what they want to invest in. Whereas greenwashing is when there is a misrepresentation in what you're doing. But that's not the case here. What we still need to work on in China is develop the investor base, clearly. I mean, there is a dynamic in Europe, now clearly also in the US, but in Europe, driven by the investor demand, that for the moment, I would say, is not fueling enough the market in China. It's growing, it's increasing, but right now the market is too much driven by the fantastic innovation coming from the from the issuer, advised by their good banks, but also and also by the support of the policymaker, because in fact, clearly, those issuers would not do those trades without the support of the policymaker. We need to have more investor dynamic, investor diversity, opinions, and that is also fueling the market a lot. So that's what I see clearly for the Chinese market. But clearly, the pace at which it has been able to move on in the past makes me quite confident about the fact that we will have it.
Fantastic, thank you, Tanguy. You've raised some interesting points, and I think when it comes down to the greenwashing point, you're absolutely right. The key thing is transparency and honesty, and that's what we see in this market today, and that's to be applauded. Of course, the other thing you raise is the need for a science basis, and that is very true. It is one atmosphere, it's one world. While we in Europe and you as a French citizen, me as a citizen of Ireland, working on this European taxonomy. In China, we have Dr. Liu especially, and both Dr. Liu's working on this work, and we need to bring that work together. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is a world bank. It's a bank that looks way beyond the confines of any single country. I'm interested, Stefan, you've been listening to this discussion. What are your thoughts on the opportunities that you see and the hurdles? You're working across so many countries. You've done a climate change investment framework. Give us your reflections on this.
Thank you, Sean, and CBI for inviting and organizing this panel. It's very well timed. I think it's a very interesting topic. I think Michelle and her work on the white paper is very clear. It's very important. Just to add on to kind of what the other panelists were saying, I think the hurdles and the challenges are pretty clear, right? Lack of data, communication with the investors, with the issuers, alignment with the regulators, and having a global way of kind of being aligned. And then obviously it really comes down to what I think Tanguy was saying, which is transparency and honesty. And if we can get to that ideal state, then it would be just a much simplified problem. But I think on the opportunity side, I think it's a little bit harder to see. I see actually a lot of cottage industries beginning to come up. And they would be, like for example, if you kind of take a step back, with the green bond and kind of the emergence of the sustainable bond market, you kind of have this cottage industry of like second opinion providers, right? That really kind of never existed. And then you have these expertise and specialists that never really existed. I think similarly with the transition, it would be very similar. You would have a cottage industry that helps the transition. I kind of think about it like Y2K bug, year 2000, but much bigger in scope, obviously, because there is a physical science related to it, and it's a global political agenda. So there are lots of opportunities. On the institutional investor side, from a pure economic financial perspective, I would imagine that as an investor, if you pick the right ones that would survive, and if you know how to pick them correctly, then that would be a fantastic opportunity, right? To see the outperformance of public global equities or public global credit spread of those companies versus those peers who are just doing better in transitioning. And they're, according to our panelists and according to market data, they are really undervalued, right? Because they get kind of overshadowed by this fear of greenwashing. And if you're in a particular industry, unless you're proving yourself, then you're going to get heavily discounted, or you're not going to get the benefit that you should be getting. So there's fantastic opportunities from an investor point of view if you can get the right kind of analytical tools, get the right data, understand what's really going on at each entity levels, and then able to track them with the right data, that they're hitting the milestones, that they're coming through with the promises that they have made. And if they do that, then I think the markets are more than happy to reward them with higher premium for equity prices, for lower funding spreads, just because it makes economic sense. Companies that will survive into the future are the ones that are ready to either transition, already have transitioned, have very good adaptation facilities, because eventually regulation will catch up, and those people that are doing the things what the Paris Agreement said they should be doing will actually benefit. So there's fantastic opportunities, from that angle. So there's the cottage industries, and then there's the cottage industry technologies. So as you try to transition, I think the fourth principle in the white paper is the technology viability. So there will be a lot of technology, and I think right now AIB is also looking at kind of opportunities in infrastructure technology, and a lot of them does have to do with kind of climate change and climate action, right? So there will definitely be a lot of space for those kind of companies. And then, as I mentioned, institutional investors. Going back to the major hurdles, I would say there's really two major hurdles that I see. One is specifically for Asia. Asia, especially if you kind of look at China, it's to kind of borrow from Alvin Toffler. I think he wrote this book a while back called Third Wave, right? Where you have different stages of the economy. So you have agrarian, then you have services, then you have kind of knowledge workers, right, in manufacturing. In China, all of these things are happening at the same time. So I would imagine in the world of transition, these things are also happening at the same time, where you're skipping generations in technology. So how do you kind of deal with that, where in the developed world, you're looking at incremental changes? In the emerging markets, you actually have the opportunities as well as the challenges to, can we skip a generation in technology to get to a greener, to get to a more climate friendly kind of future? The other one I would imagine is, when we're out there in talking to issuers and investors, they want to focus on NDCs versus net zero, right? And that debate is something that is not exactly clear everywhere in the world. And I think the more science-based, facts and figures and kind of projections come out, I think it will be more clear. But NDC versus net zero is going to be a topic that's going to be around. Because now I think everyone, unless they've been hiding under a rock, agrees that the future will be in climate finance. The question is the end goal net zero, and by what time? And is it going to be, or is it going to be NDC, and the fine tuning of that? So I see that as a major hurdle, out here in China as well as in Asia.
Thanks, Stefan. So really what you're saying is we need clearer guidance here on what's got to be done, because these are questions of science, which then got it. And one of the, I think, features of the work that's been happening with the Green Projects Catalogue, Lu Wenqing, and I'll ask Lu to comment on what you've just said in a minute, and the work we've done in Europe around a science-based approach to taxonomy, is to try and flesh out these questions to provide guidance. Not always perfect, but to make it easier for everyone. And in a world when there is so much science and so much noise and so on, clear targets by the central government, as we now have in China and in Europe, make life a lot easier for us. And then clear deduction of those targets, providing guidance in different sectors, becomes the critical job for us to do to make it easier. I mean, we need investors, as you say, Stefan, we need banks, we need everyone to have a common language and a common understanding here. For those of you that are listening, you can ask questions in the Q&A chat. We'll attempt to answer a couple of them. This session will be recorded. You'll be able to get a copy via climatebonds.net, where you will see a webinars page. In other words, you'll be able to listen to points that you weren't sure about in the first reading. First, can I now ask Wenqing, you've been looking at this issue of how to develop science-based criteria. In the chat, we've had a couple of questions like, is agriculture part of transition? What are the definitions of transition? How well do you think we're making progress on this? Do you think it's clear? How much work have we got to do? How far along? Are we 10% of the way of understanding what transitions need to be, or are we 90% of the way to understand what transitions need to be? What's your view at CEP? Wenqing.
非常感谢这个小冉，就是说这是一位观众提的问题是吧？因为这是一个农业的问题，如果是客观的讲，我们对农业也不是非常的了解。如果说涉及到一些技术的细节、一些标准的细节，我想我们可能不会解答的非常清楚。但是呢，我也想提到，就是说其实农业也是存在一个转型的问题。我们在这个温室气体排放的一个很大的种类甲烷这方面呢，我们从这个数据也可以看到，就是说农业领域排放的甲烷呢，基本上要占到25%左右这样一个水平。然后呢，农业可能我们大家也看到了各种各样的一个专家的介绍，虽然我们自己本身不是专家呢，我们也在关注这方面的一些，就是一些研究的成果，比如说我们通过这个种植品种的调整，一些技术手段呢，也可能是对农业方面呢的一个甲烷的排放，或者是其他的一些排放呢，我们会有一些比较好的措施。我想呢，就是说这是一个技术问题，但是这也是一个非常重要的一个领域，我们不应该去放弃的领域。农业其实也很重要，不光是我们的工业，工业可能大家看到的都比较明显，农业呢和我们的日常生活是息息相关的，但是呢，我们又 非常有挑战性，我们离不开它，但是我们怎么去转型？我想这个问题，我想还是留在我们行业专家去更加清晰的阐述为更为恰当一些。我先谈这么多观点吧，好吧，谢谢。
Thank you. Tongi, I know we need to lose you. You've got another commitment in a few minutes. Can I ask you for some final remarks about the sense of opportunity about this? Is this going to be big? Is this going to be niche? What do you think is going to happen?
No, it's going to be big. It's already big, and it's going to be big. I think at the moment where you have issuers like sovereign or multilateral, like the European Union issuing billions and billions, it means we'll have portfolios of billions, and that's true for central bank too. In fact, it means that at some point we may have also the Chinese government issuing green bonds, certainly, or maybe the US government issuing green bonds, certainly. So we'll have billions. And I think we will have also billions of sustainability-linked bond, this market emerging right now and coming as a tsunami. So this will not be niche anymore, that's for sure. I think we will have those elements of sustainability, be it through use of proceeds or through trajectories, into financial market. The question will in fact be the quality and the integrity of what we are able to do, and how it will move the needle in terms of channeling more investment toward green assets and extracting investment from the stranded asset that were, or the future stranded asset that were mentioned earlier on. And so that's why, again, I insist on my first point. I think designing, if you look at investment bank, we are here also to drive, to assist our client in this market. It's not anymore right now what you need to do a green bond, or what are the specificities of this product that will become mainstream because it's going to be big, but how to drive them into the science. In fact, as I said before, how green it is and how best practice it is and how is it moving the needle. That would be the next big question into this already very big market.
Thank you, Tongi, for those hopeful words. Thanks for joining us. We need to move into wrap up. We've got a lot of questions. We're going to answer those as much as we can by text. We'll keep the lines open. But I need to go to speakers to ask for some final comments. And Tongi, we appreciate it. You've got to drop off. Thank you for joining us.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask you, Seng-Wei, Dr. Liu, from China Industrial Bank's perspective, what do you see as the problems getting this going? Do you agree with Tongi says about the difficulty of getting the science-based? You made some comments along these lines about the need to understand the coal, the gas, the transition to others. Is this that hard? You've been a critical player at CIB in getting the green finance market going. So you should know.
好的。其实对于这个市场本身来说呢，我认为是现在有着巨大的潜在需求，而只不过咱们 CBI 和其他的一些这个组织呢，把这个潜在的需求讲出来。因为我刚才已经讲了，仅仅靠传统的绿色的融资无法支撑起整个经济的转型。那所以从这个意义上来讲，转型金融会是一个巨大的市场和蓝海，而且对于每一个它只要有更低的减排的意愿来说，其实它都应该被支持。所以呢，我觉得如果要把它能够和洗绿区分开来，如果要把它能够和一个经济体的这个综合的时间点衔接起来，我觉得恐怕需要2个方面的工作。如果这个做好了呢，我们可能这个市场我觉得会发展得更快。那第一个呢，我觉得其实在 Michelle 前面那个报告里面有讲到了。那么对于我们是不是可以首先明确一些重点的行业，就是尤其是在可以预见的将来，这些行业仍将存在，它的排放又很高，所以我明确这样的一些行业作为重点行业。然后呢，针对行业类的技术，就是科学家们可以看到的这个技术，设定排放的阈值。那么只要你 在这个碳排的阈值之下，那我们可以认定你是转型融资。我觉得呢，这样呢，其实就在这个转型和洗绿之间可以画一个比较清晰的界限。当然哈，我得承认，这种办法依然不一定能解决个体层面的减排合成到整个经济体层面，它是不是一定能在那个时间点上实现中和？所以呢，我们就还需要有第二个建议。那么，对于每一个经济体来说，如果它有了总量层面的按时间的减排的这样的一个轨迹的话，那么而这些又被分解到了每一个行业的话，这样个体就可以非常有效的和这个国家的目标和国家的时间点清晰的衔接起来。而其实我认为啊，这个在中国是最有实现的可能性的，在其他的任何的国家恐怕都不一定有这么好的实现的可能性。因为在今年这个中国政府明确的表示将会制定达峰和中和的时间表，就是说具体的落实的这个路线图，然后压实各地区各行业的责任。那么一旦各个行业的责任压实，这个它的碳减排的要求，就是具体的量有了，那么它一定会对这个行业里的主要的企业会分它的这个碳减排的任务。那么这样有了这个任务之后，那么我就能知道，只要你在这样的一个排放的标准之下，那么我就认为其实你属于转型债，而且可以有效的把个体和国家的目标结合起来了。当然，对于第三个建议呢，我觉得对于金融机构来说，我们的确可以依据碳足迹的方法核算这个金融机构融资的碳排放强度，并且将这个经济体的减排的路径或者中和的路径和我们金融机构跟国家层面的这个路径去对比，那么你肯定不能明显的偏离国家的路径。那我想，这是不是一种解决我们讲的问题的几个可以思考的办法呢？好，我就先说这些。
Great points. Thank you. Really, really useful points. And we agree with you fully about the important need to develop targets and guidance in these areas, which is something that we will be supporting Dr. Liu with for the Chinese definitions and working on it internationally. And I hope, Zhenguai, working with you to be able to guide the market going forward. Stefan, can I go to you for final remarks? Help us wrap up the thinking here. How do we take this forward?
Thank you. So again, science, very important, and having a connection with what you're doing in terms of transition and the science of it to kind of a Paris Agreement, or at least the national, and then from the national to kind of the Paris Agreement is very important. But I think on a very detailed level, I think the white paper mentions several issuances that were done with transition as a theme. I think we need to have, since the white paper, I think we now know how to frame it better. So when I say frame it better, what's ironic is the institutional investors really want to buy things that make sense for them and from a climate perspective. They want to do the right thing, and the issuers also kind of want to do the right thing. So I think ironically, what gets missed is the communication, and with the framework and with kind of all the work that's being done, I think that is getting better and better. We just need more cases of it. So we need cases of successful transitioning, companies that issues bonds, that communicates in the right way, using the right vocabulary, having the right milestones with the correct kind of science that backs them up, that people think is credible, and then hitting the milestones. And if we have more of those, then I think it becomes a very credible market. Right now, it's the infancy market, so people are just trying to just set things up. But once it wants to become a credible market, you have to have relatively standard way of doing things. And I think the white paper and the framework is very good in setting that up. We just need now more transition bonds by real issuers with real investor purchasing and actually building that track record in the market for various different sectors. And I think AIB as a multilateral, we're very interested in doing that, like rolling up our sleeves, getting really dirty into it, and just really helping in communicating the corporate strategy of transformation and transition to the capital markets by helping them communicate better, setting up the route milestones, and then helping them to verify and use the scientific methods to do that, and not making only pledges, but really actionable, kind of like measurable, those type of things. So we want to not only do one, but we want to do a series of them to really show both the investor community how it should be done, and also the issuers how they need to proceed in order to be convincing and credible to the market. So we're interested in doing that. So whoever is out there, please contact us if you're interested to work with us. And we hope to be working with CBI on that mission critical, like the nitty gritty of getting more of these transition bonds done in the market.
Thank you, Stefan. It's going to be our privilege to work with you in taking this forward. We need to wrap up. Can I ask Lu Wenqing from CCP? You're at the heart of this. What's the next step for you? What's going to happen next?
嗯，这个非常感谢提问啊。这个我想呢，就是说，在中国我们绿色金融市场的一个发展呢，是有一个比较良好的经验。我们采取了这个自上而下的这个推动。那么，相对于市场的一个自发的一个行为呢，我们可以看到这样的一个，就说我们的力度还有我们的这个规范的建立呢，可能相对就会更有一些动力存在。我们的政策的边界的条件，可能就适当的走在了一些前面的领先的这样一个地位。我想呢，这都是一个比较良好的做法。我们会把这个自上而下的推动和自下而上的这样的一个投资者这个驱动呢，我们良好的结合起来。就是我们最近也在学各个部委的一些文件，包括我们人民银行行长的一些，就是说政策精神讲话了。我们觉得，就是说他也提到了我们怎么去适应气候，继续完善我们金融的一些体系、政策激励的体系标准，包括我们银行要和这个应对气候相关的一个适应，就说是政策的一个调整吧，继续的一个完善。我想呢，就是刚才几位嘉宾也谈到了，就是说我非常赞同刚才鲁政委还是 Steven 提到的。我们转型金融实际上相对于我们绿色金融呢，面临更大的一个挑战。我们就说是在项目的技术的识别上、标准上，我们可能会有更高的一些要求。为了避免洗绿呢，我们实际上需要在这个我们的一个具体的项目的标准上面，我们比如说我们的排放标准，我们的一些方法学，我们碳排放测算的一些方法学。这些都是非常关键的一些基础的一些措施，我们必须要跟上，我们必须要集中专家力量继续完善这一块然后我们以便为这个我们金融机构吧，我们提供一个更好的一个支持我想提这么一些观点吧，谢谢。
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Michelle, you started us off. Finish off. Final reflection.
Sure, I completely echo what he's just said. It's absolutely essential that we talk, that we work on this together. A comprehensive explanation for everything might decrease uncertainty and anxiety, but I'm convinced it's only with uncertainty that human creativity is unleashed. I applaud all of the efforts that our speakers are doing in this space. And I leave you with that final comment from Cristiana Figueres, that it is up to us to transform the reality we have to the reality we want.
Thank you, Michelle. A beautiful finish. You've heard a lot about our challenges. You've heard a lot about, on this session, what transition looks like. You've also heard that it's the science that counts. You've heard from Lu Senghui, you've heard from Tanguy Claquin, from Stephen Shin and so on. And that is what we're going to see this year, a lot more science. We will make it easier for everyone through this process to know what to do. And that will unleash a tsunami of capital market engagement and involvement, led by the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and by the Industrial Bank of China. We will see more preferences for governments for this. Incentives will become the norm. Of course, while we're looking to the brutal truth of last year's pandemic, and this year's in many countries like Paris, we're in lockdown, we also need to look to the new reality around 110 countries committing to net zero and carbon neutrality targets. This is now the majority of the world's GDP, looking to the certainty of change going forward. This year, we should be working on how we collaborate better on the science, like Michelle, like Wenjing says, and on other matters too. There's lots of talk of carbon tariffs in Europe. There's lots of talk of trade wars between China and the US. This won't go away, but I think there will be something new, which is talk of a green window between our economies. Think of this as zero tariffs for zero carbon steel. The green window will be, must be, a critical part of our thinking going forward to encourage all our economies to collaborate, to work together. Europe, China, the US, Japan, the UK, to be shifting to the targets that we've all agreed we need to achieve. A thought for you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you so much to our fantastic panel, to Lu Wenjing, to Tanguy Claquin, Stephen Shin, Lu Tseng-Wai, and Michelle Horsfield. We have a lot of work to do. We have a fantastic team here working on it. I look forward to working with you, all of you, this year to transition China's economy and transition the world economy.